Cool.
All right, welcome in everybody to this special episode. It's the lawyer you know here, and we've got Kurt, Chief Bitcoin Historian at CoinGeek.com. He is a Bitcoin guy. He is going to tell us so much of what we don't know on my channel because we just talked for a minute before, and I said, I'm not like being modest when I say I don't know anything about this stuff. I really don't know anything about this stuff. And he is a Bitcoin historian. So it's really awesome to have him on, give a totally different perspective, and give a lot of people that don't already follow him, it's going to give them an opportunity to learn about why we're here in this Kleiman v. Wright trial, what it could mean. And then we're also going to jump into what's happened over week 3. And we'll talk about how the court system works. And I'll add something to this conversation maybe, but we're going to talk to Kurt and listen to Kurt as much as possible on this episode because his time is valuable. And we're really excited to have you, man. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, it's a pleasure. It's an honor. I've been watching your updates too, so I appreciate them. Somebody sent me your first one on week 1 and said, "Hey, this guy picked it up. He's got a cool channel." So I was like, "Oh, cool!" Like, I loved your first episode, so I watched the second one, and I'm enjoying them too. And now I'm like, I get to be a fan, and now I'm on your show, so it's great.
I appreciate that, man. Yeah, it's one of the things that's really interesting is when these types of cases come up. Some lawyers are experts already in this stuff because they're really into it. But there's all sorts of topics that come up that we don't know a lot about.
Sure.
And then we become experts in them by the time. Like I guarantee you, these lawyers are experts in cryptocurrency, and they can, especially the plaintiff's lawyer. I bet you they could tell you everything about it. So it seems throughout the case. But so you've been boots on the ground literally throughout this case.
Every moment.
And you know what it's like now for the lawyers, man. It's no joke. Trial lawyers, it's no joke.
It's brutal. It's a marathon. I have an incredible amount of respect for the profession, especially watching. I mean, just how professional both sides are. It's a grind, and they both are very, very talented. I did like debate team and stuff in school, so for me it's a little bit like, oh, okay, I'm starting to figure out like what the rules are here, and kind of having fun with it too. So it's a lot of fun. Let me give a little bit of background on the case, and unfortunately this is like impossible to do justice because of how complex this case is. But basically, Bitcoin started in like 1970 because there was like cryptocurrency. This notion of a digital cash system goes way back. So there's a lot of weird interest entangled in this idea going way back. But we'll start at 2008 when the white paper landed. The Bitcoin white paper solved the double spend problem and gave us a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. The software launched in early 2009. Satoshi Nakamoto spent a lot of time bootstrapping the network and explaining the network to people. And then he disappeared at the end of 2010. It was pretty mysterious why he went away. People didn't really know what happened. But stuff has leaked out in the preceding years. But there's been a million theories. It's who is Satoshi Nakamoto? Is it Hal Finney? Is it Nick Szabo? Is it any one of these other dozen cypherpunk people that you might have assumed it was if you're into computer science and digital currency? And then all of a sudden in 2015, Gizmodo and Wired magazine, both at the same time, put out a docs. They gave out the identity of an Australian computer scientist named Dr. Craig Wright, who was not on anybody's radar as someone who could be Satoshi Nakamoto. So instantly everyone's, oh, who is this guy? But they also mentioned Dave Kleiman, who's another guy who wasn't on anybody's radar. Dave Kleiman had already been dead for about 2 years when he was mentioned in the article, so there was no feedback to get from him. And then Dr. Craig Wright, when they basically go pound on his door, media and all this other stuff, his house is being raided by the Australian tax office at the same time that the article launched. And so media is like, okay, he's in tax trouble. Is he here? Nobody knew where Craig was. Like, what is going on with this ridiculous story about the creator of Bitcoin? So it started off as like a perfect cloak and dagger prelude. Turns out he had moved to London. He started a bunch of companies doing research and development. Like, oh, he's a member of this giant research and development firm in the UK trying to do really, really progressive changes and crazy stuff that everybody said is impossible to do with Bitcoin. He's at the head of a company that's trying to push those limits. They're called N-Chain. And it's like, okay, like, let's dig into this. Well, At the same time, there's also what's called the Bitcoin Civil War. There's a how should Bitcoin scale debate. And because there was no leader there, Satoshi Nakamoto was gone, it was up to debate. Is there a roadmap? And the answer was, well, not really. Only if you're going to dig into that roadmap. But that's a little bit of a tangent. After he was doxxed, we found out that he had been in communication with a guy named Ira Kleiman, who's the brother of the deceased Dave Kleiman. A lawsuit started, some proceedings started in 2016, I think is when some of this stuff really started to sort of bubble up. Craig Wright kind of disappeared for a while. He came back in 2017. There was a big split in the Bitcoin community, split to Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin Core. And then Craig gets sued by Ira Kleiman finally for half of the Satoshi fortune. But this was after the Bitcoin community had largely decided that Craig Wright was not Satoshi Nakamoto. And the reason was that they just simply didn't like what he had to say. The proofs that he had given were sort of insufficient from a mathematical standpoint in some regards, but the reasons for it are above the heads of basically anyone. So it's a bunch of super high level cryptographer and math nerds debating about why something is imperfect as a piece of proof. And then it was just disseminated out. Craig Wright's a fraud. He's not Satoshi Nakamoto. If he was, he could do X, Y, and Z, and he hasn't done that. But then there's always been this case. But Ira Kleiman is suing him for 550,000 Bitcoins that are known to be the property of Satoshi Nakamoto because Bitcoin's public and they were mined and they're sitting there and everybody's waiting. Satoshi Nakamoto, as far as anyone's aware, has never spent a single Bitcoin that he mined. So this has been a thing in the Bitcoin space. Is he dead? Is he waiting for something? Is he, if he ever spends those coins, there's not enough liquidity in the market to even bear him selling even a fraction of what he owns. It would crash the price immensely.
That's one of the questions I have about all this is collectability. How do you collect this if you win?
It's I have some theories, but ultimately this is no precedent on top of no precedent on top of no precedent, wrapped in a $65 billion case, wrapped in whether or not Craig is even actually Satoshi or not, over and against, okay, well, then why have the plaintiffs probably, I'm guessing the value on their side in money spent has got to be somewhere in the ballpark of $50-ish million in everything that they've had to do for years of litigation with a high value. So it's like, whoever looked at the evidence thought there was at least as much money there to maybe cover the nut on some of that. But long story short, there's a couple things at play. There's two camps as to what this case means. It's either at some point Craig Wright proves definitively through evidence in law that he is Satoshi Nakamoto, like that we're given some piece of evidence that we have not seen before, something under oath, forensic data that can't be falsified, that kind of thing. Or it's the end of the road for this whole narrative, and everyone's broke and whatever. Everyone just wasted a bunch of money for some kind of theater that nobody would stop bluffing on, I guess. And so we're getting pretty close to finding out which is which.
So would you say it's beneficial for Craig to prove that he's not Satoshi because then he doesn't have these Bitcoin? Like how what theories does he have with that? Or does he just want to prove that he is for everything that comes with it?
Craig has been very open for the past probably 5 or 6 weeks now that regardless of outcomes, whether he wins or loses, coins are going to move. The Satoshi coins will move and prove that he is Satoshi Nakamoto. That is what Craig keeps saying about it. I actually asked him about it today and said, Craig, man, watching this case evolve and watch how things are changing, like, where's your head at? What do you like? How do you want this to wrap up? And he said, I already said the coins. and he took a sip of his drink, when he walks off. I was like, okay, that's still what we're going after, I guess.
I just know how it works in some cases when you go in and you get a big verdict against somebody personally, let's say. Mm-hmm. And if they have property that's not protected by homestead or something, and you can try to do a lis pendens and try to get that property as part of your judgment and what the steps are that take that. And I'm thinking, how in the world do they plan on forcing him to give this money? Can we call it money? What are we going to call it?
It's, I don't know. I see it sort of like suing someone over like a big piece of property or something, or maybe stock could be something that's relevant. Like, hey,
but law enforcement can go get that property.
yes,
if it's a big piece of property.
Sure.
Like if a judge orders him, you have to give this. And he says, it's literally impossible for me to do that, Judge. I don't know if we're sophisticated as a legal system enough to handle something like this. If there's a judgment somebody doesn't want to pay, that a jury gives him at the end. That's the weird thing to me, that, it's like if somebody sued Bill Gates for every dollar he has and the judgment said, yes, you have to give it. It's like, you can't do it.
Yeah.
You can't take every dollar he has.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So something Craig has been talking about for probably the last 18 months or so is how keys are not identity. Craig is a I believe he's a doctor of law, international law. He's got a number of PhDs, he's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's all these other things. So Craig likes to wax philosophical better than most, but he has been talking about how ultimately Bitcoin is just a ledger. It's really all it is. It's a ledger of account. And the only thing that stops somebody from moving something from one side of the ledger to the other is that you have to get the nodes to agree that it happened. And so if you tell them that they must agree that it happens, then they are compelled by law to obey. So a lot of people think of Bitcoin as something that is outside the law, that jurisdictions can't touch it because it's not really an asset within jurisdiction. But Craig would argue, and I think quite effectively in many regards, although it's very hotly debated, he says it's just like anything else. If you create a new financial instrument, it is still subject to existing laws and jurisdictions and everything else. And Bitcoin really isn't any different. Now, people say that it's sufficiently decentralized to never, be enforceable. But Craig argues too. He says, if you look at the countries where these things are mined, something like 85 or 90% of the nodes that mine Bitcoin are in jurisdictions that at the very least have agreements with the United States or UK governments. So this is places like Hong Kong, Singapore, or generally the UK, EU, or the United States. And if you serve court orders to these entities and say, hey, this was a major decision in US court, it'll be honored typically by those jurisdictions, who will then send court orders to those various nodes where they choose a day where all of you are going to make this change to the ledger and you are going to move these coins from here to there. And anyone who disagrees is then in arrears of the law. And if you can get, a sizable chunk, if you get basically more than half, and the more that you get over half, then the less likely it is for whatever that minority who disagrees, it's less likely that anyone will take them seriously. Especially since everyone is so obsessed with the price, and the price is set by essentially exchanges or people using exchanges. But a lot of these exchanges are regulated businesses too. And so if Coinbase and Kraken and all these places are also served court orders and saying, hey, you're going to follow this chain, like that's not, I don't know. It's unprecedented, but I don't think that it's that complicated.
It's just hearing you explain it, A, sounds complicated. B, doing it with money that we know where it is and property we know where it is complicated.
Yeah.
And then C, so a question I have is, can you freeze this stuff? Can the government freeze this cryptocurrency or any of Craig's assets that he apparently hid and transferred away from the Australian government?
I mean, I don't see why not. I mean, governments have frozen all kinds of things. They froze Liberty Reserve 10 years, 12 years ago, or whatever that was too. Like a lot of these projects appear to be decentralized or just like anything else. It's like, I don't know, can we take down the drug cartels? And it's like, yeah, more pop up, but you do actually take these drug cartels down, and you do it through forensic accounting, and then you squeeze them, and then you start bleeding them dry until all of a sudden they're forced to make a dumb move, and then they're under arrest, and you took down the whole crime family. And it's like, it's complicated.
They used to have the old saying that no one talk and no one gets in trouble, right? When it was back in the day, enough that you couldn't track anything, no documents, right?
Right.
So what is so I get these questions like, oh, wow, it's great to see that you're not biased. And then some people in the chat are like, oh, wow, you are biased. I'm like, what are the sides here that people are taking? Because I don't even frankly understand the sides.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the Bitcoin Civil War.
Sure.
Starting in it really heated up in 2015. Ultimately, there are two camps. There's the camp that says you can never change Bitcoin by way of a hard fork, which means change the protocol rules to something that are different, like the consensus rules, rather. You can't change the consensus rules via hard fork, or else you have made something that isn't Bitcoin. The other side looked at it, the big block, and I'm a big blocker for the record. So that side is the small blocker, BTC. It's the more accepted reality about Bitcoin. So I'm presenting and an advocate for the minority position in Bitcoin.
Okay.
And what I believe is that if you look at the original Bitcoin protocol, we actually did a bunch of these sorts of changes for the first several years in Bitcoin, and not Satoshi. Satoshi did not, but going forward after Satoshi disappeared, they immediately started to make very, very deep and fundamental changes to the Bitcoin protocol. And they locked it down in such a way that it basically can't grow. They put shackles on it and then said, okay, now you're not able to mess with it anymore. But I'm an old school guy. I'm a 2012 Bitcoiner, and I remember when this stuff was happening much more regularly. And I remember fighting about it and saying, hey, hold on. We need to be taking shackles off of Bitcoin and getting it back to the way it was, because the way that it was had no limits. It allowed Bitcoin to grow based on whoever could grow it. Like, let's make it a global economic tool, like a frictionless global cash, this global computation system that allows us to value all data globally. All of this stuff was stripped from the BTC Bitcoin protocol. But throughout it all, amid this war, every time they would make a deep and fundamental change, the Bitcoin protocol would go forward, because there was always a group that said, no, we're going to go the direction of Satoshi's vision. And I'm a Satoshi's vision guy. And so we are now multiple protocol splits where BTC split away and they went a different direction. Then Bitcoin Cash split away and went a very different direction. And now BSV, the Bitcoin SV protocol, has been restored as the way that Satoshi Nakamoto implemented it. And it was no block size limit, no standardizations, basically no arbitrary software level swim lanes that people need to stay within. It is a open, flexible economic tool that gives people opportunity to make anything. If you send a transaction that does anything you want, if you pay the fee and a miner accepts it, then it is a valid transaction, and you can push apps up into the stack. You can do all kinds of things. You can literally, our goal in BSV, in short, is to replace the internet with Bitcoin, all of it. And everybody says this is impossible, but this
replace
was Satoshi's
the internet
vision.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. it's like just like a whirlwind.
It is a lofty goal, but if people look into what Satoshi wanted to do, Satoshi talked about, hey, we want micropayments to fuel everything. There should be a global cash that people can put tokens into a vending machine from Bitcoin, or they can hop on an adult site and pay for whatever and keep it private or public or whatever they want it to be. But he even bootstrapped. There was a poker game built into the original Bitcoin. Like, let's have everybody play together. And like, all of these things were taken away under this assumption that it should be turned into an investment asset. It was never intended to be buy some, get rich, maybe sell some at some point. Like, that's not something really that was ever discussed until about 3 years into the project, where it was like, well, hey, it's scarce and it's provably scarce, and so it's a good investment, right? And then that became the predominant narrative because it's so simple.
That's interesting that's not what it was all about.
It's a cash system. If you read the Bitcoin white paper, he opens up with the phrase commerce on the internet, and he talks about the problem that PayPal is too expensive for half the world to use, because they have a minimum, basically $5 is about the lowest thing you can do on PayPal. But he says, look at half the world, or look at the opportunities even in the first world for sub-cent payments and identity solutions and logins and all these other things that you can do with your Bitcoin keys if they can scale up, and we can use them for everything. So it's a great data security system. It's a good way to prove the existence of data. So, I mean, we can do things as simple as replacing notaries, but do things as complicated as turning every piece of owned property into an NFT. And there is a global attestation of the ownership of every asset on Earth that can't be tampered with. And so
But can it be?
Yes. Yes, it can.
That's one of the things I thought was so interesting about this trial is I'm like, the little I know about Bitcoin, one thing I thought was cool about it is like, well, we can track all this and trace all this, and now there's no argument about who. It's like a Tesla, like if my kid has a Tesla, I can see how fast they've been driving and where they've gone, and I can track everything on them,
Yeah.
And yet, all it takes is one person to be like, oh no, they forged that. Oh, he has ways of doing it, even though it's billed as something that you can't forge or fake, or like
No,
you're saying.
Here's the thing. Every single action done on Bitcoin is saved to Bitcoin forever, period. So if you forge something, you might be able to trick someone into believing that forgery, but anybody, like if they go to look back, if they maybe assume maybe he screwed me, you can go look back at the chain of custody and say, oh, nope, that's where it was forged. Here's the hash. Here's the forgery, fine him or whatever. And so that's the beauty of Bitcoin. And this is an interesting tangent in this case, is that this case is essentially a fraud and an identity case in many ways. And Bitcoin was designed to get as close to the elimination of global fraud as humanly possible. That's really what the underlying problem that it solves is fraud, or attestations of the truth are permanent. And so it's just a really
that's what I found interesting too.
Yeah,
I found that really interesting too. So all right, so we've been following along the case the first couple of weeks, and from a lawyer's perspective, it seems like a movie production, or they're trying to make it into this big thing that it doesn't seem like it is. I don't understand how someone's paying for the plaintiff's side of this case. I really can't figure that out. Did anything happen in week 3 that felt like a smoking gun, that felt like, oh, wow, they actually do have that? Or to make you think that they're making some headway in proving by a preponderance of the evidence in this case that that Dave Kleiman and his estate is entitled to this Bitcoin?
I haven't seen it. And granted, I'm a little bit biased to the
So that's what I was
defense's
going to
side.
say. So is like your bias to Craig Wright? Was that what you would say? That's what it seems like, I would say, just because you said you talked to him and stuff, and it
Correct.
seems like you speak fondly. I'm not saying you're biased, but I'm saying if I'm just listening and I don't know either anything about this. I mean, Ira Kleiman doesn't seem like my favorite kind of person, how they're describing how he's suing all of his brother's friends and didn't care about his brother at all.
Right.
But seems a little opportunistic to me. But I don't feel any type of way about Craig Wright either. So I was picking up on that.
Sure. I'm a Bitcoin researcher primarily, and I have become a fan of Craig Wright. I started as a critic several years ago, looking into all the people saying just write him off, don't look at him. This is why I ended up looking at him. And the more that I looked, I was like, you know what? I think all of you guys are bad guys, and Craig is imperfect. He's a difficult fellow for sure, but yeah, sorry, I agree with him about Bitcoin, and I think that his even the challenges with him, like maybe he did amid this tax investigation or whatever, like what do you do to survive massive audits on your companies and all these different things? Like maybe he did something wrong at some point in here, but that's not even what's really being discussed in this case, so it's kind of irrelevant. But ultimately, yes, I am rooting for the defense, I suppose, but ultimately, even if Craig loses this case, it's not really what it's about for me. I want to see the outcomes. I want to see evidence come out of this that tells more about the history of Bitcoin. I'm a Bitcoin historian, so this is my stake in the game, is like, give me something juicy that I can do more research on. Like a new hint would be really exciting at this point in the game. So but yeah, the defense, I think, has made the case crystal clear that there was definitely not any solid evidence of a partnership. There was a really good chunk of circumstantial evidence, like in communications, but all of it is from after Dave died, and all of it is from Craig Wright. I have not seen any evidence, and we have now seen several witnesses this week. In fact, just today we had 2 of his close friends, business partners, confidants. In fact, the dude who spent 5 days a week with Dave for years in the hospital as Dave was dying said No. Unequivocally, Dave never said a single word about Bitcoin to me ever, and he could not code, period. And I know this because he would send me the stuff that he needed to have coded, and I would pick on him constantly. My joke with Dave is that Dave couldn't code, and this is why we're friends. And so if Dave had no ability to code, then what could his contribution of Bitcoin or to Bitcoin could have been? It's essentially nil. And Craig has already admitted in an open court and said publicly, Dave helped me edit the white paper. Like, this was Dave's role in Bitcoin. And that anything else that he said was him trying to pump up his dead best friend. Like, when his father asked, well, what did Dave do? It's, oh, well, he helped guide me through this. Like, Bitcoin wouldn't have existed without Dave. But this is something that you say essentially at the funeral of your best friend, right? And under oath, Craig has said, yeah, I exaggerated about my dead best friend, but he helped me with the white paper because that's what Dave did. We have this history of Dave helping me with white papers. They're published, they're known. There are plenty of papers that are a white paper by Craig Wright and Dave Kleiman. It's never Dave Kleiman and Craig Wright. It was always that relationship. So no, I think the plaintiffs are in a really rough spot. They have a lot of circumstantial evidence that I think the jury will be sympathetic to. But if it's got to be about a preponderance of the truth, I don't see how this could go the plaintiff's direction.
When I think of sympathy, right? If they're planning on sympathy winning the day for them, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think juries usually look kindly on an absentee brother and are they hearing about the state that Dave was in when he passed? Has that happened in front of a jury? Because one thing I'm always
all week. Yeah.
Okay, because what I'm always careful of, especially in federal cases, is we hear these things and it has to be secondhand, and people, get on me in the chat. Oh, this is just secondhand stuff. It's like, yeah, I'm at work. Okay, I can't go and sit in this trial all day.
Right.
So and that's why we have people that are reporting that it is their job to do that, and you rely on them. And anything in life, that's how it is, right? And so to hear how it's going in federal court, sometimes the jury is not hearing even a percentage of what we're hearing being reported. Yeah. It's not like the Rittenhouse case where you can watch all of the videos and live testimony and everything that's happening in court. So from that perspective, do you think the jury is having any sympathy on Ira Kleiman and on the plaintiff?
I mean, Ira has not, he was on the stand 10 days ago at this point or something like that. And I don't think he was a particularly good witness. He doesn't come across as a likable guy on the stand. And then he's a little bit of a weird fellow, just generally. And then we've heard now from multiple friends that, his friend today, Kimon Andreu, was by his side 5 days, like every day after work for years, would pick up dinner for Dave and go eat dinner with Dave for like 2 or 3 hours a night. 5 days a week. I mean, this is the kind of commitment, like, this is a best friend. Like, and the question is asked, like, did Ira ever show up? The answer is no. And then even when dead, so Craig's testimony was, I knew of Dave's fiance. So when I heard that Dave died, I reached out to the fiance who told me Dave has no family. Like, Dave's brother is dead, is what he was told.
Right, he has a different brother, right? That was dead.
Yes, they have an oldest brother who had also died already, and so it's just the whole thing. Also, Dave Kleiman was adopted into the Kleiman family. A lot of people don't know this. They're not blood brothers either, and so there was an estrangement there.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Have they seen the will? Because there was talk of a will. Is that an exhibit in court?
Yes, the will was from 2003 and did name Ira as the sole beneficiary and executor of everything.
Okay.
Which is probably, I mean, it's Ira's best piece of evidence, obviously. But
right.
when the family says Ira was gone, and we've come to know, or not that Ira was gone, that there was no other family. We've also come to hear that essentially, Dave was a little bit disorganized. He was broke. Like, he was not the kind of guy that would have updated his paperwork. Would that have been an opportunity? and ultimately didn't talk to Ira at all those last few years. For nearly 3 years, not a single point of contact between the two. And then ultimately, Ira wasn't really involved in anything involving the estate. He did not try to wrap up anything about the estate until there was this, oh, maybe there's a chunk of money there. And like, that's another thing that the defense has said, well, did you try to wind down his businesses? Did you do any other work into some of his business interests? Like, if you inherited these things, like, he was a businessman, he had a couple of different ventures he was involved in, and it was all kind of like, there's nothing to worry about there. But then got very, very interested when the Bitcoin thing got mentioned. And so I think from a narrative standpoint to the jury, if I'm a juror, I'm looking at this situation, I'm super sympathetic for Dave, who sounds like an awesome guy. Like, Dave Kleiman stands out as like, I would have loved to have had him as my best friend. And Ira, on the flip side, it's like, even if Craig screwed somebody at some point, I don't understand why anybody would want to give any compensation to Ira at the end of it, because he just seems like an unpleasant beneficiary of all these things. He seems like the polar opposite of Dave, and whatever Dave's will, like, Dave would have given his money to the VA or given it to his
best friend that was there every day with him. Like, you hear stories about that all the time. Yeah. I mean, now that's not supposed to come into play, obviously, for the jury. They're not supposed to think about that and whether or not they feel bad for Ira and should give him the money. But if one of the ways that you're saying, one of the only positives for the plaintiff is that there could be some sympathy for Dave, I think that's going to be counteracted and counterbalanced by the lack of sympathy towards Ira. That's like what it seems like, at least from all reports that I'm reading, not just yours. And I mean, that just is kind of the vibe I'm getting from the trial. And the plaintiff has the burden. And when you don't have the main person there to testify and to say exactly what happened, it's really hard to carry that burden. And in federal court, so some people don't know, certain cases get to federal court that should never be there based on diversity of citizenship and a case in controversy over $75,000. And the reason some defense firms love to get to federal court is we, as plaintiffs' lawyers, and this is a question I have for you, aren't allowed to pick the jury, meaning we're not allowed to actually talk to and ask questions to the jury. The judge does the questioning, and sometimes we're allowed to follow up, and sometimes we're allowed to submit questions to the judge. How did jury selection go in this case? Were you able to sit in on that or no?
So that was the one day that I was forced into a media overflow room. So I only got to hear audio. I did get to hear proceedings. I did not hear any questions from the counselors, but the judge did certainly ask questions, and she was clearly interviewing. I don't know if anything happened that I don't know, unfortunately.
So we, in our federal jury trials, we submit maybe 100 questions to the judge, and they usually read 5 to 10 of them. They have their basic ones that they read, but the defense says you're conditioning the jury. When in reality, we ask questions like, if we're going to ask you for $1 billion and the evidence points to that being a fair and just verdict, would you be able to give it? Because if a juror says no to that, they're disqualified. You have to give the money amount you think is just and fair in this case. So there's all sorts of questions. There are certain people in this world, fair or not, right? I'm a plaintiff's lawyer. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. Like, I represent clients that hire lawyers. But there are a lot of people in this world that think if you hire a lawyer, you're a scumbag and I'm not giving you anything you want.
Sure.
You're money hungry, money seeking, slime ball. Like, this is the problem in America. Everybody's too litigious. And you don't get to weed those people out if you don't get to look them in the eye and have some dialogue with them as the lawyer, which is what's really hard about federal court. So it's an uphill battle for the plaintiff in a case like this is what I'm getting to, with not having Dave Kleiman to testify, not being able to pick their jury. How many jurors are there?
10.
10? Do you know if there are any alternates?
I don't know if there are any alternates. There, juror number 7 left early last week with a fever, and there was some talk about like, what's this going to do? It was not suggested that an alternate come in, so I don't know if that's an indication, but I don't know.
So is 7 out now?
No, she came back fine. So it's they're all 10 have been in court the whole time they've been in court. Yeah.
Okay, so the one we just did, we picked 8. and no alternates, 8 jurors deliberated. There's a little bit of difference in federal court than in state court. It's usually set. So I would guess there are 2 alternates.
Okay.
And that 8 are going to deliberate, but maybe they can have all 10 deliberate if they want to, I guess. I mean, the federal court judges can do things sometimes that don't make sense. How has the judge seemed?
Very fair. I actually really like her. I wasn't sure what to expect. I didn't know anything about her. I didn't want to like see which president appointed her or anything. So I really don't know. But she's been tough but fair. She's very almost motherly to the jury. I think it's kind of funny because she's very tough on the lawyers. She's tough on the room. But every time it's like they're her kindergarten students coming in. When they come in, she like stands up and smiles and I'm so grateful for you guys. Like her tone changes. I think I don't know if that's a common thing, but it's interesting to see. But otherwise, no, I think she's very fair. She's very balanced and comes across as generally curious about the case. And yeah.
So, and what I think is funny about that is that's how just about every judge is. They're super nice to the jury, but they're on us like crazy because they want us to be, especially federal court. Now, in state court, you said, so this is another question I have for you. In opening statements, a lot of people described it as theatric. Were they moving around the courtroom and getting exhibits and getting up close to the jury, or were they having to stay by the podium?
No, they're floating around whenever they feel like. So there's,
so that's unusual in federal court. Usually they make you stick to that podium or within arm's length of the podium.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they've had the boards and let's bring out the stuff, and now it's bringing out a bag of hard drives and setting it in front of the jury and leaning against the jury the wall that they've got, the partition. And so no, it's very in fact, opening day was like unbelievably theatrical. With Kyle Roche, I think really embodied it the best. He walks over to the jury, he's hemming and hawing, he's got his hands behind his back, and I'm like, this is like a movie, And he turns around, and he's like, I'm going to ask you guys to listen to what that man, and he turns around and points at Craig, and Craig's sitting there in the chair, and I was like, oh wow, he's going to yell at the jury and point at Craig, and it was like Broadway. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean it's so much fun, but in federal court usually it's a lot more buttoned up, and we have gotten all of our trial presentation software basically to an iPad with an Apple TV and an Airport Express, so we don't have to get onto the courthouse Wi-Fi.
Sure.
And we just are presenting it all with that, and it works great in federal court because we're not allowed to move around as much. Now, with a trial like this, maybe the rules are a little looser, and if everybody agrees, and it depends on the judge. But judges can be, like in our last trial, the judge was just riding the defense lawyer the whole time. And he was getting so mad about it. But every time the jury comes in, she's just peaches and cream to him, and everybody's so happy and sweet and nice. So it is funny just to kind of see that dynamic. But sometimes a judge can really seem slanted in one direction or the other. And sometimes I think that can affect the jury because, like you said, juries usually feel like the judge is so nice. So they like the judge.
That's their advocate.
Ever the judge's fault. Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that's been interesting. Has there been masks and stuff like that? Are there the COVID protocols down there?
Not for the witness or the judge, actually. So the two counselors who are doing exam and cross exam have been maskless, and the judge. But there's it's kind of a mix. So there's one bailiff who is like Mr. Rule Enforcement guy.
Yeah.
And so it's like if the mask comes down past the nose, he's walking, hey, very, and then some of them are just on their cell phone with their own mask falling off their face too. And so it's a little bit like, well, I don't know. Well, and typically, bringing coffee in has been fine. And today it was like nope, none of that. And
seems like a lax federal courtroom, man.
The bailiff today made everyone throw their coffees away. So it was,
I mean, you can't bring anything in the middle district where we just were still. It's all masks. Can't bring anything in. Got to have a court order for a cell phone, an iPad, anything like that. No water bottles, no coffee, no nothing.
Crazy. Okay.
They still have the little, like you see in the movies with the coffee thing that you pour into the little plastic cup, and you like, you see them like liar. I always think of when he's trying to pour. That's exactly what they had in our trial last week.
Those are up there. So the at the counselor's table they do have the plastic coffee carafes or whatever they are. Or maybe it's water. I don't even know.
It is water. Well, it's usually water. Yeah. So overall, before this trial started, Do you feel like you knew or thought you knew that Craig was Satoshi? Do you think it's multiple people? What's kind of your feeling on that?
So I wasn't sure how Dave Kleiman played into things because I had seen the emails that the plaintiffs are using where Craig was puffing up Dave. So I was like, I don't know what Dave did, but it was something, you know. It is a pretty unpopular theory that Craig Wright is Satoshi at this point.
Mhm.
But in my research, I have decided that it's much more likely than not that he is, despite it being an unpopular theory. And the reason comes down to a lot of it comes down to stuff that really only Satoshi could know. So it's an analysis thing. I'm a really good judge of character, and this is something that I really pride myself on. And I'm an investigative journalist as well, you know. So
Mhm.
I bring it down to three things. The first one is the fact that Craig in 2015 gave a presentation in front of a hostile crowd and explained how the Bitcoin protocol is Turing complete, which is a computer science thing. And everybody on stage laughed at him and disagreed with him. And the other people are legends that everybody knew. And Craig stuck to his guns and said, nope, here's why it's Turing complete. And everybody said, Bitcoin can't do that. That doesn't exist in Bitcoin. That's not there. But what he explained to them was a bunch of the vestigial code that people have debated. Why did Satoshi put this in there for years? And they were so unsure why it was there that the developers by that point had actually turned off most of the functionality because they weren't sure about the security problems that it would cause to leave it all turned on. So they just basically turned off most of the Satoshi stack in Bitcoin because they didn't know what the risks were. And Craig just shows up and just starts opining, just, you know, going on and on about all the things that are possible in script. And all these, they were Bitcoin developers are sitting there like, looking back, they're like, what the hell is this guy talking of? Like, there's no way this is real. And so they wrote him off. They literally laughed him off stage. But then people started to do what are called Turing tests. There are ways to see if a system is Turing complete. And they still actually argue like, no, it's still not Turing complete. But there are several computer scientists who are like, actually, the way that Craig described it, it is absolutely Turing complete. And so this is the kind of thing that Turing completeness was never talked about in a Bitcoin discussion ever before Craig. Nobody had ever suggested it. And so the fact that he suggested it and then it then went on to be proven by various means by totally independent thinkers was a little bit like, ooh, okay, wait, how did he know that? How did he even know what any of this giant chunk of scripting language? It's like a whole, essentially an operating system that's dormant in Bitcoin. And Craig's out there talking, well, here's how I programmed it and here's how it works. And then you go test it and you're like, oh, that is how it works. That's interesting. So it's kind of like, I don't know. It's like you met the guy who engineered a car that nobody bothered to drive because it was just so complicated.
Mhm.
And he gets in and just shifts it into gear and takes off and takes it around the racetrack. And you're like,
It's a great analogy.
yeah.
That's
And
or
so there's,
illustration or whatever. That's great.
yeah.
That works for me to see how you can be so confident about it because you'd have to know how complicated it was to
Mm-hmm.
see that he's able to get in and drive it. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
To me, knowing absolutely nothing, and nobody really cares about my opinion on this matter, but it seems like it's got to be a group of people. Like it just seems like you're saying, like it's just so but that could just mean he built it and had help, you know, and he's the mainstay of it, and then a bunch of people helped him.
And that's actually his story. His story
Okay.
is essentially that I'm the architect, and just like a building, the people who build it are the stone people, the glass
Right.
people, the steel people. But I'm the architect. Like I had to make sure that the whole system would work in my head and built this thing out mentally, wrote the protocol, wrote the paper. I think the other thing that's interesting too, we've had a couple of software experts look at it and say, no, it's very clearly one guy who coded the original client. But the funny thing is that the original Bitcoin didn't work that well.
Okay.
And a lot of software people jumped in to fix it very quickly after it was released. And everybody's criticism was, yeah, it's a very old-fashioned way of writing this code style, which is called C++. And they all comment, they're like, I've never seen somebody code it that way. It's like it's like somebody like writing in Old English. It's like if I sent you an email and you're like, why the these and thous and ye's and like, it's very like, who writes like this? I'm going to clean this up so this reads better. But that's how Bitcoin came out. But what we know about Craig is that Craig was never a commercial coder. He never did software development in business. But what we do know is that he has a computer science degree from a very old computer science school where he was teaching computer programming for old school supercomputing. But Craig's experience is learning to code in like the early 80s, machine level coding. Like he programmed video games and stuff back in the day, but Craig never had the experience that a lot of these other guys had in the 90s and 2000s, where everybody basically just got more robust and experienced and decided like, okay, we're going to start using more packages. We're going to use these updated versions of this C language. And Craig just never did any of that stuff during this 15-year period when people just got really good at it. So when he coded Bitcoin, it has the tone to it of somebody who basically hadn't coded anything in 15 years. And that stands out. But Craig fits that profile really specifically too. So Craig will give credit. He says, absolutely, like Bitcoin would have fallen over if it wasn't for the help of Hal Finney and Ray Dillinger. And so he hands that credit out openly. But he says, I wrote the original protocol and I wrote the white paper that defines it. And I am Satoshi Nakamoto, period. That's the story. And people just hate it because they don't like him and they don't like the politics of the Bitcoin civil war looms over. Like
right.
He's on the side of the unpopular side. And so
I'm frankly shocked at how fired up people get about it. Like to me, I'm like, oh, whoa, okay, that's my bad. I don't even know what I'm saying half the time that offends people. I'm just trying to talk about the court case, and talk about what the evidence means and what I think they need. And it's hilarious to see it happen.
Here's why. A lot of people got really rich by accident. And they weren't investors. And now they're experts, right?
Right.
But now Craig is this gigantic existential threat to their wealth. And so when Craig's like, it's my protocol, I did it. You violated my license. I may sell 1 million coins and crash the price. Like people are thinking about like, oh shoot, I got loans out against my stack and I'm going to get liquidated if the price goes down to, $5,000 again, like I'm done. I'm going to lose my house. And so that's really what's at play. That's why Craig is such a problem. And
it's like Elon Musk on steroids. Right?
Very much
like
so.
When he tweets, 100%. Then the stock goes down. Yes. All right, let's get into the chat for a little bit. Whenever you got to go, just tell me and we can cut it off. But
sounds good.
Let's see what kind of questions they have here. I'm going to try to get to as many questions as I can. A lot of people saying great stuff about you. They're saying you look more like Chicago Kurt, not Miami Kurt. I assume that's based on the style.
I'm from Chicago. I recently moved to South Florida, so that's my fans are aware.
Nice. All right. Hey, Laura, question. There has been no evidence that shows Kleiman was part of a formal agreement with Wright on the Bitcoin project. Will it be a clear win for CSW in your opinion? So, yes, it seems like they don't have any formal agreement or they would have brought it out by now, I would think. But there are other ways to prove that he is entitled to half of this stack. I also don't think they've really brought any evidence of that, but I don't think there has to be a formal written agreement that says, this is how many Bitcoin belong to you. I'm signing this over to you. Here you go. So we'll see. It seems like the defense is definitely winning, but you never know what a jury's going to do.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see what else we got here. And then people asking questions like this. So we've already hit a lot of these questions. Do we think there's a lot of evidence showing that Craig is Satoshi?
Craig actually says Satoshi, so it's
listen to that. Come on, I got lambasted the first video I did for saying Satoshi. So I've been doing my best, but that makes me feel better. Good. So Ellie, so it looks like you missed your update. Anything big on today's update?
Not huge. I think the biggest thing was just how sick Dave Kleiman was for the last several years of his life. We heard from an infectious disease expert, and we heard from two of his very close friends. Dave needed constant care. He spent 850 days in the hospital in the last 2.5 years of his life. It looked like he slept at home like a dozen nights in 2 years. And it was a nightmare. constant care. He had no control of his bladder sphincter.
That's terrible.
It was constant bed rotation, all of it. Really, really rough. So then this notion, because part of the case is, did Dave help Craig mine Bitcoin? And at the beginning
While
of the
laying
trial,
in the hospital bed?
correct. So there was a lot of contention. Like, there are racks of servers somewhere that Dave was managing for Craig, and it's impossibly clear that he had no ability to secretly manage racks of servers somewhere. So I think that's a big one. And then also proof positive from multiple sources now that he was laughably incapable of coding. Like, from his best friend, like, he was picked on for how bad he was as a software developer. So that's the
gist.
one. Yeah.
All right, good question here. It's wine 30. What is the minimum proof required to bring a civil case? So my wife literally asks me all the time, can somebody sue people for that? Can you get sued for this? Can you sue for that? The answer is, unfortunately, a laughably low bar to bring a civil claim. And if you don't get the case thrown out by not having any evidence, it just has to be some kind of evidence that any reasonable jury could rule in your favor on a claim. That's what it is. And it's the preponderance of the evidence. So we say a little more likely true than not true is what the jury instruction says. And we sometimes say in closing arguments 51%, but the reality is 50.00001%. It just has to be a little more true. So unfortunately, it's not that high of a bar. Yeah. This is good. I want to get your opinion on this too. So it's wine 30 again. How would the defense benefit in this case by bringing in an Asperger's expert? So I'll answer from a legal standpoint. And then what I want from you is, have you heard this before? Did you think this about him? Is this just a ploy in the legal case, kind of like some other people have done in the past? But the reason is it can really, I don't want to say color, but it can show the jury why some of these emails were like they were. It can show the jury why certain conversations were like they were, and why Craig may have said and done certain things that wouldn't be maybe normal for somebody that is socially aware and socially acceptable and around people all the time. Because you have to realize a lot of people like this, and I don't know Craig Wright personally, but he seems like a Bill Gates type figure. They don't just like sit around with normal people and talk all day. They're a little different breed. They're genius level. And, on the Asperger spectrum, being genius level, that stuff is pretty normal. So I think it will help them kind of explain away some of the curt and no pun intended, and short emails that may have come from Craig where they're trying to make him seem like a bad guy, but instead maybe get some sympathy. But did you have any inclination that this was a true diagnosis for him?
First of all, thank you for using Kurt as an adjective. It's a word that is not used enough that way. No, Craig. So I've known a number of people on the spectrum. First of all, Craig clearly has Asperger's.
Okay.
I've had dinners with Craig. I've known Craig. I've known him professionally for a few years. Amid this case, I've actually spent a lot more time with him than I ever have in the past. But it's you bump into him in between things. Like, you end up like, hey, should we just have dinner because we're talking? So that kind of thing happens. He will start a conversation in a place that's very unclear why he started the conversation there. It's as if he was assuming what you were talking about before was something else. Eye contact can be problematic. He clearly gets an anxiety about crowds. He gets you can feel his anxiety is palpable under situations where there's stress. He's also like extremely pedantic about things, and just always, like, even in casual conversation, we're talking about whatever, like, he will answer your question and it's like, well, it's not really what I was asking. And then, but he clearly doesn't get it. And then if you bring it up with him again, like, it's clear that he got it maybe later and he will clarify, but he clarifies in a weird way. So it's like all of these things that you get from like a general, like, he has a clearly different personality. Another thing I should point out is that I've been sitting next to his executive assistant for a lot of the trial, and he stood up from the morning session today and handed her a wad of lined paper, like a big stack of lined paper full of what looked like chicken scratch to me, and started whispering to her. And I'm like, man, what was that? After he walked away, and she looks at it and she's like, oh, it's a white paper. And I'm looking at it, and there's math equations, there's descriptions, there's more math equations. And I'm like, so what is it? And she's like, I think he just invented something. I'm going to need to type this out and send it to R&D. And so amid his trial,
Yeah.
Craig is sitting and doing math and writing a white paper about some idea that he was inspired to have. And so that's really how he expresses himself too. So I think having an Asperger's expert come in to explain, like, yeah, he's not going to be your best friend in a way that makes sense to you. But he does math like nobody's business. Like, that's,
yeah.
I think that'll be very clarifying for a lot of things, frankly.
So I'm getting a bunch of questions like, can we get you on Hand Cash and Twitch? What's your Hand Cash account? I have no idea what any of this means. Yeah, I still have PayPal.
I can clarify for it. So if you want to get the Hand Cash wallet, so Craig is the chief scientist at a company that is primarily working on Bitcoin SV, the Satoshi vision of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. Twitch is a social network that is built on the blockchain. So a lot of what I was talking about when I was kind of giving you the BSV narrative, the stuff isn't theoretical. The stuff exists in BSV. Like, we've actually proven that you can build a social network in Bitcoin. You can build a giant chain of custody tool, or just really simple wallets. So if you wanted to get a Hand Cash handle or join Twitch, I'd be happy to get you to do that. People
are asking me. Yeah, people are asking me, like, just tip Kurt. Just tip Kurt. All right, tip in my tips in Hand Cash and Twitch.
Perfect.
Okay, what's the possibility of an appeal regardless of the outcome? Huge possibility is what it sounds like. If they've spent this much time and money on it, they usually don't go away easily. Especially if there's a resounding win for one of the other. They're always going to say, oh, I can't believe this happened. And then an appeal can just be another form of leverage, and they can continue talking settlement. Usually settlements happen after the trial and you appeal, and one side has a lot more leverage but still wants to get the case over with. So sometimes they still settle the case afterwards. All right, let's see here. Question for Peter. If Wright has to pay a settlement to IRA, would it be in Bitcoins or in US dollar? Well, it seems like what they're after are specific, you tell me, but like delineated Bitcoins. So I think that is what he would have to give over in the settlement, like you said, because you described it and compared it to a piece of property. So if I'm trying to take your house, I need your house, and it can have some inherent value. Now, you can appeal and go forward and pay it off in US dollars if you want to. Sometimes some judgments usually can come down to US dollars or force a sale of that property to pay the value of what that property is. But what do you think?
I think that's actually unclear. I mean, they're clearly talking about 1.1 million Bitcoins, but they're also talking about intellectual property and some of the valuation of the shares of W&K and some of this other stuff as well. And this intellectual property they're claiming has now been repurposed and commercialized and is now worth extra money too. So, but none of that, I haven't seen a valuation on any of the IP. And then the Bitcoins, they've debated with every witness that has wanted to talk about the Bitcoins and the value. They keep saying, well, price isn't value. So we could give you X amount of Bitcoins as settlement, but if you're looking for a dollar amount, like, we would need to establish how much time do we have to make that happen, because the second a Satoshi coin moves, everyone's going to try to front run Satoshi by selling first, and it's going to cause a market crash. So I think a lot of this is very unclear. And that was also a cornerstone of their 26-page motion is, hey, we haven't established a value. They can't establish a value. And they're not like, so what are we even fighting about? What is the outcome that we're even looking for here?
Is this kind of going along with what you're saying? That if the coins move, is that going to tank the price?
Oh, 100%. As a culture, the Bitcoin culture has long said that the most bearish possible thing is if a Satoshi coin moves, because he is believed to be the largest whale in the Bitcoin economy. And so if he wants to dump it, he can dump the markets harder than absolutely anybody.
So as a historian who's into this and obviously invested in it, I assume, isn't that scary? Like, one guy, if he gets mad, you guys are just you're like, whatever. I'm like, oh my God, that scares me, man.
I get it. I think for me, that's not really what it's about. Like, the investment aspect of Bitcoin isn't the exciting thing. Like, sure, my portfolio will be, problematic in that regard. But I'm also not, Bitcoin isn't the cornerstone of my wealth or anything either. So,
Okay.
I'll be fine if the Bitcoin price like gets wiped out. But specifically, BTC and BSV are different blockchains with different valuations now. So there's this upside potential for the BSV people. Like, well, Craig's been saying BSV is the real Bitcoin. So if Craig is proven to be Satoshi, that becomes much more bullish for BSV and bearish on BTC, which he's been saying for years that BTC is essentially valueless. And the reason is that BTC has been re-engineered to do nothing but absorb value. And what Craig keeps saying, and what I keep saying, and other people, other big blockers, is that Bitcoin wasn't designed to absorb value. It was designed to create value. But you can't create value with BTC. You can create it with BSV. And so we're excited about the business opportunities that the Bitcoin protocol makes possible.
Have you faced any backlash from Bitcoin cult members for talking to people that sympathize with Craig Wright? Yeah, it's crazy. Like we've done some trials, and we've talked about like the Derek Chauvin verdict, and we're doing the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And I feel like this stuff is coming hotter from these, BSV, BTC people more than like the national, political divisive nature of those trials. So it's been really funny and interesting. And I mean no offense to anybody. I think all this is really interesting, and I like learning, and nobody I've talked to like you or anybody that I've talked to or read seems to have any animosity towards one side or seems like a douche or anything like that. It's like, this is what I think. And there are reasons I think that nuanced conversation is important in our country on all levels. And you gave a very well laid out, thoughtful reason why you think this way. And it is what, and guess what? People don't agree with you. It sounds like they can bet on the other side, right?
Precisely.
Question here. Can Dave's fiance testify? She can, but the question for Kurt is, do you think she will?
I have seen no evidence of it. I know that surprise witnesses are a thing. I've actually heard some hints about another surprise witness, but
that's always fun.
I'm not gonna spill any beans there, but I really don't. I don't know. It would seem she would be a valuable one, but I don't know that story at all.
All right, speculation. I don't think the Kleiman side ever intended to win this. They're looking for more evidence to use in other cases like COPA. What's COPA?
COPA is the Crypto Open Patent Alliance. They are an organization made up by Coinbase, MicroStrategy, and Square primarily. So it's Twitter, Coinbase, and Michael Saylor's company. Like a lot of money on that side. Amid some of this drama about Craig Wright leading up to this case, they decided in UK court, because Craig was awarded the official publishing rights and is recognized as Satoshi Nakamoto legally in the United Kingdom as the copyright holder to the Bitcoin white paper. But he won it in default. So then people are like, well, whatever. But everybody knows the alias that was being sued. And so people got really pissed off that this character named Cobra would not reveal his identity in order to testify against Craig. So COPA said, you know what? We are going to sue Craig in, I believe, UK court in stating that Craig Wright is definitively not Satoshi Nakamoto and that he doesn't have any rights to the Bitcoin white paper. So they're taking it upon themselves to proactively be plaintiffs against Craig again in somehow proving the negative that he's not Satoshi is the cornerstone of that case. And so I don't know. It's been theorized by some people. I had theorized it in private myself and had discussed it with a few people that what are the odds that this Kleiman thing, who there's also been rumors is being funded by some of these same characters. Is this all like a war of attrition against Craig to make sure that we're talking about basically being litigious instead of being, working in business and developing BSV, basically. So is this just a bizarre theater in the Bitcoin civil war? And maybe
what's interesting is not knowing, anything about what's going on with this COPA case. There's no better way to get your hands on documents you would have no entitlement to, but for a federal civil lawsuit in America. And especially when we're talking about financial documents, protected documents that you usually don't have to turn over for anything. But if you really did want to fund, and that, I mean, to me, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but if I'm a big corporation that could stand to gain a lot from this, you go talk to Ira Kleiman, you're like, hey, bro, let's do this. You just got to show up. Don't worry about it. Like, we'll talk for a little bit. Then you don't have to stay the whole trial. And we'll just get all the information we can. If we lose, we lose. But that's really interesting to me. So there's also something that, I mean, I wouldn't think, unless you've heard through the grapevine, do you know if there have been any offers of judgments or proposals for settlement or anything like that made from either side? Not settlement offers, but actually official documents filed with the court.
I don't know. I don't think so. I remember when the Copa case started, and Craig immediately was extremely excited because he's like, "Oh, good, another jurisdiction in which I get to reveal more evidence that I'm Satoshi Nakamoto against these vipers." So, I don't know.
So if you file an offer of judgment in federal court, the other side has 14 days to accept it. And if they don't accept it and you go to trial and you win, not only do you win, but you also get all of your costs. And then sometimes, if it's a proposal for settlement, which you have to file through the state laws, you can get your attorney's fees. So that would be a mechanism where it gives Craig Wright some upside to where at least, you know, it doesn't seem like he needs it, but the money back for it, or vice versa. So that's just an interesting tool sometimes lawyers will use.
Interesting.
Hi, lawyer. You know, if Craig wins this case, how would that affect the ownership of the disputed assets? Does the court have to establish this fact? No. So if Craig wins, that just means the plaintiff, theoretically, it means the plaintiff didn't prove their case, and therefore they just find no. They don't necessarily have to find that Craig owns any of this. They don't have to find things like that because that's not the plaintiff's cause of action. They have to make a decision on the plaintiff's cause of action. So, you know, that Craig didn't act in a fraudulent manner or whatever, you know, but they don't have to actually say, oh, this is Craig's, that's not Craig's, this is Craig's, that's not Craig's. They don't necessarily have to decide that at the end of this case.
Interesting.
All right, let's see what else we got here. So do you know about Ira selling the case to a third party?
It's been discussed. I don't know if it's true. I've heard rumors of a litigation purchasing firm called Parabellum being involved in potentially brokering the outcome of this case to some unknown investors. Which, if that was the case, my immediate spidey sense would have a pretty short list of people who would be interested in the outcome. Craig has a lot of enemies in the Bitcoin space, and they have gotten very rich in the last few years too because of the Bitcoin price action. So
interesting.
Yeah.
All right. What is the benefit, if any, is a character witness like Donald Lynam? Does the character of Craig Wright have bearing on whether or not there is a partnership? So give us a little quick recap of Donald Lynam.
Don Lynam is Craig's uncle on his mother's side. It seemed like he participated a little bit in helping raise Craig, because I don't think Craig's dad was in the picture. Don Lynam was a software developer. He's an 80-year-old man. He was a software developer for the Australian Air Force back in the day.
Wow.
And then Craig's grandfather was some kind of secret special something or other, like for the UK government back in the day. He was doing secret mission stuff related to like Bletchley Park and breaking the Enigma code and all this different stuff. So Craig comes from a family of cryptographers and software devs and all this different stuff. And Don told probably an hour and 20-minute long, here's how Craig was as a kid. Here's how he was always interested in Japanese culture. Here's how he got involved in computers. Craig didn't have a lot of friends, but ultimately gravitated to me and his grandfather and blah, blah, blah. So we get to hear this sort of endearing story about Craig. And then we get to hear that Craig really found a love of mathematics and then began to become very successful in writing mathematical theory sort of white papers and things. And he's like, I was kind of a father figure to Craig, and he would have me proofread his papers. But after a certain point, I became incapable of proofreading his papers because they just got past me. And then he said, then I remember he created the token software for Lassiter's Casino in 2006 and 7, and it was a global monetary system for lassiters to allow settlement in the fiat currency of lots of jurisdictions, which is starting to sound a lot like Bitcoin. And he's like, and then he gives me this white paper that's 60 pages long, and it explains Bitcoin. And he kind of explains to me, it's this global money system, it's a monetary system, it's a cash, and does all that. And he's like, again, like, Craig, I don't know, like, I'm unqualified at this point. And then he says, as soon as the network launched, he was very surprised to hear that he wanted to use a pseudonym. And he said, well, Craig, why not use your name? You're always so proud of your work. And he said, well, because I want it to be a fair money. I don't want it to be about Craig. And if it's about Craig, then it's a problem. It becomes a different kind of asset. Like, I want the money to be emergent, you know? And so he's just telling this story, and he comes across as a genial, nice old man. And then he explains how he ran a Bitcoin node starting basically the week that the network started, and ran it for 2 years, and gave a long anecdote about, I had a quiet computer and I had to put a fan in it and blah, 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 blah. So just like, you hear this whole story, and it just adds a lot of credibility to Craig, thinking about it for a long time, working on it for a long time, giving it to his uncle to proofread, and then bootstrapping the network by using real people. Because part of the contention too is, well, Dave helped him bootstrap the network too, and there's just really not any evidence of that either, unfortunately. But this guy gives a sworn testimony that he was. So I think he was a fantastic witness. I think it's problematic that he's his uncle, because I think that comes across as like
biased.
Right. But
yeah,
but he was a very sweet old man, you know. So
what I think is funny is, like, an average person that may sit on a jury. So yeah, we lawyers always get into the bias of every witness, right? Whether you're his uncle, whether you're an employee, whether you're a former employee who hates the former employer, whatever it is. If one side's calling a witness, usually that witness is going to be good for that side. So it's like, it doesn't take a far stretch to show. Now, sometimes there's huge bias. Like, we have doctors that make $8 million a year from this insurance company. That's their full-time job, right? Like,
Yeah,
they're going to be biased. But, you know, I mean, it's funny to think that, like, it's such a big deal that this witness could potentially be biased. Here's a question from somebody that I know watches a lot of my videos, Alana Johnson over in Australia. She's struggling with the terminology, right? So she's probably just tuning into this case because it's interesting to her, because it's the legal case, and she seems to follow a lot of those. Is there somewhere, maybe it's your site, and if it is, maybe direct her to a specific video you made or article you wrote? Is there like a 101 lesson to help her understand what's going on in the case?
It's a little bit of a tough one.
The beginning of this video was really good, in my opinion. I think he broke it down in layman's terms as much as he could.
For sure. I mean, I don't know. The problem for me is, like, a lot of the basics stuff will lead her down a path of the other side of the Bitcoin civil war. So this is my bias showing a little bit.
Okay.
I need to write. It sounds like I need to write a 101 document.
I think that would be, I mean, if this case really gets the interest it probably deserves based on how big it is, I don't think that's a bad idea. And I mean, I'm not going to say that people are usually biased towards the first 101 article they read, but studies show that the first viewpoint to breaking it down and simplifying and helping them understand it usually is the most powerful.
For sure. I can give a couple quick recommendations. There is a bitcoinsv.com that I helped write some of the material on. A lot of it won't be basics, but there is actually like a 101 section there. And actually, now that I think about it, so I write primarily at CoinGeek.com, and we actually have a Bitcoin 101 page on that site that's
what I'm trying to say. Plug it in.
I am reminded now. So yeah, CoinGeek.com. I also write a weekly editorial. So if you kind of want to follow, I don't necessarily do news. I write a lot of like Bitcoin history stuff. So if you're interested in sort of the nuts and bolts and how we got where we are, I'm going to plug my own writing. So please check out CoinGeek.com for the 101 and my thought leadership on that stuff,
everybody
please.
That's here from my page that's interested in this case or interested in this stuff at all, check out the website and all the videos. And there's plenty to learn, you know, just however much time you want to put in it is how much you can learn about it. So go subscribe to his page and check out his website.
I appreciate it.
Let's see here. So, hi, Laura, and Kurt. In the case of a defense win, can Dr. Craig ask the court for an order to assign coins Is federal court able to give an order to make minors do this? In the case of a defense win, why would this happen?
I think so. There's this question of, even if Craig is Satoshi, is it possible that he lost the keys? Because
Okay.
people have been telling him to prove he's Satoshi for a long time, and one way to do it is to make a transaction, and he won't do it. And so there's been this theory, like, man, he's either just not Satoshi, or he's Satoshi and he screwed something up. So I don't really know. I mean, it's an unprecedented thing. In theory, yes, it could absolutely happen. The technical part of it is very simple. It's the social and legal stuff. How do you coordinate a global network of nodes to do everything on one day, and whatever other ramifications are there? So in short, yeah, but it's never been done.
That's just another thing for a very lay person in this field that scares me. If the guy that created it can lose the key, you better believe I'll forget how to access any of my stuff.
Yeah.
Laura, does the plaintiff have to prove both an agreement between Craig and Dave existed and the percent ownership, or just one? So this is kind of a non-legal question, because they basically just have to prove Dave Kleiman's right to property, right? And I think that the way it's kind of seemed to have happened is the transfer of that 500,000 plus Bitcoins that went back and forth, the forged signatures, the documents that kind of showed that a certain amount of the Bitcoins do belong to Dave. And I think they're saying that because there was a partnership. I don't think they're saying there was a 50-50 partnership and that's why we're splitting it 50-50, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah. In fact, it's been a little unclear. We've seen actually a lot of figures that are, maybe Dave only had 200,000 or 300,000, or does he deserve the 5.5 or 5.5, whatever it is, 550,000? So I don't know. And again, that's actually what the defense keeps saying too. Like, how much are we talking about, plaintiffs? And they really won't answer that question either.
Lawyer, how likely is a judgment as a matter of law in this case? So that's interesting. I would be surprised. It's very unusual that they get granted. So don't get too excited, anybody that wants that to happen. But when you have a case that it just feels like there's no evidence, you as a judge are afraid that the jury is going to come back with something that just doesn't make any sense. So that's the reason you would grant it. But I would be very surprised if it was granted. All right, we're getting here to the end of the questions.
Cool.
Anything that you want to plug or talk about now before we go? I know you've plugged some of it, but anything else?
Follow me on Twitter. If you want to learn more about Bitcoin, I'm happy to take DMs or help you with things. I'm also interested, like, one of these things, I don't know how you become an expert witness in Bitcoin, but I'd love to try.
So I will tell you. So
yeah.
So let's talk about that for a second. Because I saw it somewhere. I don't know where we talked about it or something where you said you can make $500 to $750 an hour.
That's what they've asked every. Is that common to ask every witness how much they're being paid?
That's the bias. Yeah, that's the lawyers trying to create bias. So at the end, what I like to do in my closing arguments with the doctors is say, the $8 million man over there says there's nothing wrong with my client because that's what he gets paid to say.
Sure.
So yes, so you just have to pass the Daubert standards, and we'll do it. We should do a video talking about that because it'd be interesting and just kind of go through what the Daubert standards are, because you would probably fit it. You don't have to have a certain degree, or you don't have to have like even specific things. You can get it by training and experience and being published and peer reviewed and whatever it may be, and being recognized in the community as an expert. That can go a long way. So it really doesn't take much, as we saw from, I think, one of the experts in this case who didn't seem like much of an expert, right?
Yeah.
And that guy was making $750 an hour as a consultant. Yep. So yes, that is a very interesting topic we could talk about.
Sounds good.
So yeah, go follow him on Twitter. Go send your tips to his hand cash, Twitch, whatever it's called.
Follow me on Twitch. Yeah, honestly, check out CoinGeek.com, read my articles, and give me retweets. Like, that's great for me.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, and if you don't subscribe to my channel, if you're here from Kurt, hit the subscribe button, like this video, please. We'll keep doing videos on this case, Kurt. Thank you so much for coming on, man.
For sure. My pleasure.
All right. Take it easy.